And Professor, it's a pleasure to speak to you. How are you?
Great pleasure. Yeah, good, considering how bad the circumstances are.
Bad. So what makes them so bad? Do you think this is all part of the negotiations, or are you worried things are getting out of control?
Hard to tell, isn't it? Because we've got a complete asymmetry in terms of competence on both sides of that negotiation divide. You've got the Iranians on one side who know exactly what they're doing. They've been planning for nearly 5 decades to do exactly what they're doing, have pretty much all the escalation dominance in their hands, and they're up against a bunch of real estate guys and frankly amateurs when it comes to international relations. And then trying to bring these two sides together, and then Trump still obviously being a narcissist and being surrounded by sycophants, he kind of thinks that he can still play this to his own advantage. And I think that's where a lot of the flaws are coming in. It's complete asymmetry that essentially helps the Iranians, and that's not necessarily something that we want, because ultimately we didn't want the Iranian regime to get more entrenched, get more radical, and achieve more of their objectives, which is essentially where we're going to at the moment. So that is very worrisome.
So you said Iran's been prepared for this for 5 decades. How well prepared do you think they were, looking at where they are now, 40 days into the war? I think it's an important question because it gives us an idea of how willing they are to go back to the war so they can get the concessions they need.
Look, Iran is hurting. I think there's a lot of commentary out there saying, oh, they're winning. And, there is this old Kissinger saying, is as long as Iran is, or as long as the non-state actor in most cases doesn't lose, they're winning. And if you're the state actor, in this case, the United States, you need to win, not to lose. That is certainly true when you deal with the IRGC. I've made the case that the IRGC, for the most part, is a militia with a state. And the way they function is very much like a non-state actor, very much like the Taliban, very much like many of the non-state actors that they're funding across the region. But nonetheless, they are hurting. Obviously, it's a very painful campaign. It's one that's very destructive for critical national infrastructure. It will hurt the economy. It's not something they can sustain indefinitely forever, unless they want to sacrifice the whole country, which is quite likely. There's certainly some hardliners within the IRGC who are willing to sacrifice the country to stay in power and maintain the network of networks.
That worries me. Exactly. Who do you think has the more vocal voice right now? Who's calling the shots? The ones that put ideology above their country, even if it leads to a destruction of their country for the sake of Islam or whatever ideological beliefs they have? Or it's more the pragmatic ones like Gadilaf and the Foreign Minister Arachi? I'm leaning to the latter, and I'm hoping I'm right.
I'm leaning more to the former, unfortunately. But I would say that this is not necessarily about ideology. I think we've seen over the last couple of years a transition away from ideology and theocracy to one that is already run more by hardliners. And the hardliners are not ideological hardliners. They're hardliners in terms of being fundamentalists, being radical in their belief system. But that's not necessarily a Shia Islamist belief system. It's one that's about making money. It's about power. It's about authoritarianism. And so you're essentially building a military dictatorship. And it's run by these sort of guys who want to maintain, their gravy train that keeps them in power and makes them rich. And it's these kind of people who will do and dictate the terms. That being said, doesn't mean that they necessarily want to destroy everything. They don't have an Armageddon approach. And I would even make the case that this probably was never the case, that Iran or the IRGC wanted to sacrifice in a sort of Armageddon approach, sacrifice themselves as martyrs in a global conflict. They were always fairly pragmatic. They're not Al-Qaeda-esque.
I agree. Like we've seen them show restraint. Since well before this war, we've seen them since the Qasem Soleimani's death. Their response was relatively limited. People expected a regional conflict after the killing of Soleimani. The attack by Israel, the response was limited tit for tat. The response to the death of Nasrallah, the killing of Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. Also, the 12-day war, the response was, again, very proportional to the attacks by Israel. They tried their best not to get the U.S. involved. After Operation Midnight Hammer, their response was telegraphed to the U.S., a very symbolic response. So we've seen the regime that was meant to be, extremely ideological and obsessed with maintaining power. Obviously, the crackdown in January is inexcusable. It's a different story. But other than that, when it comes to foreign wars, even in the negotiations before this war happened, according to Oman and European diplomats, there was progress. There were major concessions by Iran when it comes to their nuclear program. And there's also the JCPOA as well. There's the fatwa that was there by the supreme leader. Not saying that cannot be revoked, but it was there. It's a religious ruling. So you put all these things together, it just seems like a regime that I dislike. I call it regime. I should probably call it Iranian government, but I call it regime after January. A regime that I don't like, but a regime that is avoiding wars rather than causing them. I'm not saying it's not causing wars regionally through its proxies, but it's avoiding direct conflict, things like what we're seeing right now. It doesn't want to end up like Iraq. And I think that's still the case right now. But obviously, if you kill enough of the moderates, you might end up keeping the hardliners that want to keep this war going. Mujtaba was never meant to be alive. He was in the house, in the building where his father was there. But now Mujtaba's in power, potentially disfigured with his family gone. So I don't know. Maybe you're right. Maybe the hardliners will remain in power. But then the question is, how capable are they militarily from what you're seeing? How much more capabilities do they have?
Let me add that they're not suicidal in the way that some people have. You know, the Israelis always kind of portray them as being a suicidal regime. They want to go to Jannah, whatnot. This is not the case. They want to survive, right? But they have quite a lot of power and a lot of stuff going for themselves. And obviously, everything that we're seeing right now, from, you know, as someone who's worked for nearly 20 years in statecraft and strategic thinking, it's for me quite remarkable how improvised everything is. Improvised on all sides. Certainly on the American side, very improvised. It's an improv war. Doesn't follow a plan, doesn't follow a strategy. I think the Iranians are willing to take a chance. It's a game of chicken at the moment, of who's going to chicken out first. And the Iranians know that ultimately the threshold of pain of America is far, far lower than that of the Iranian regime and the Iranian system and the Iranian economy. You add to this the sort of threshold of pain for the Gulf, threshold of pain for global economy. I think they have enough levers to play with to ultimately dictate the terms of whatever this negotiation is going to look like. And they'll probably be willing to do it at a cost that is palatable to them, not necessarily to the rest of the world. And it doesn't have to be militarily. Yes, I mean, Trump, the problem with Trump as well is, and all those amateurs around him, is that they still use very much 20th century metrics of success when it comes to statecraft, when it comes to military strategy, which is about tactics. It's about how many tanks did we destroy, how many aircrafts did we destroy, how much critical infrastructure did we destroy, how many ships did we sink. But that's essentially, these are tactical points and tactical metrics. None of them are translatable into a strategic political outcome. And I think that's where the problem lies. That, again, it goes back to my earlier point about asymmetry, the complete asymmetry of how the assumptions that you make and how you frame this conflict.
Do you think that's on the Iranian side as well?
I think the Iranians are, as I say, if we base it on the assumption that the hardliners are the ones who pull the brakes or kind of have the throttle in their hand, then there are some elements of hubris in it. But despite this, I mean, none of the hubris that we see on the Iranian side so far has backfired. I think they've on every junction they've been able to dictate the terms, at least since last year in June. Because you mentioned earlier, the killing of Soleimani, killing of Hassan Nasrallah, and also the 12-day war, they've always been on the side of caution. They've always been balanced. They always said, oh, we need to find an off-ramp. We have to invest in negotiation, mediation. Let's not go all out. And the lesson from that was, and that has backfired every single time. So what they're doing now is saying they're going completely nuclear. Yeah. I mean, we saw that 10 minutes into the declaration of war, the IRGC fired kind of all around, nearly 360 degrees at all the GCC states at critical national infrastructure. There wasn't a gradual dialing up. They went all out nuclear. So that's where they are right now. They're all out nuclear, and they're willing to use everything because they're saying this is an existential war. And Trump, with his rhetoric, suggests that this is what it is.
In terms of them going all out nuclear, there's talks, and that's when the ceasefire was announced. Let's chuck all these Gulf countries into the next day. But there's talks about that not being coming from the leadership. That's coming from the various commanders through that mosaic structure, that decentralized structure that they have. And if you look at the responses to American and Israeli attacks, it has been proportionate. So every time the Iranians and the US and Israel strike their gas field, they respond by striking Qatari gas field. Not only Qatari gas field, but the ExxonMobil assets within Qatari gas field, not the ones that are owned by the Qatari national company. And they've done the same thing when it comes to the threats on bridges. When their bridges were struck, their water plant was struck, they struck a desalination plant. So the escalation ladder was, the next step was always taken by the US and Israel and not by Iran. Now, one could argue that Iran from the get-go started attacking the Gulf and dragged the entire Gulf with it. After their supreme leader was killed a lot of their commanders were killed, and the US just went full-blown attack mode with no red lines anymore all over Iran. So Iran has threatened to do this time and time again. They've delivered exactly on what their threat was, that the threat was. And I think this is, again, what they consider a proportionate response to the attack by the US and Israel. So if you look at their actions to date, they seem the complete opposite of suicidal. If anything, they seem that they want this war to end as well. They don't want this war to continue, despite them having the upper hand. Now, does that mean they're going to be flexible on the negotiating table? It's different. I don't know. I really wasn't part of these discussions, but we do know that the main sticking point comes to money. Iran just wants reparations, which I think is a fair request. They're not asking for US bases to pull out of the region, even though that was the rhetoric. They're not asking for Chinese, Russian bases in their country. They're not asking for anything crazy. They're asking for, hey, we want money to pay, which based on international law, they're owed that money. But we want the money to pay for the damages that were caused by this unprovoked war. That's their position.
Well, I mean, you could make the same case for the Gulf states. The Gulf states were the collateral damage in all of that. And it's a pressure point. I understand why it makes sense logically, in order to keep a balance of deterrence, that they will attack the weakest point in this sort of US defense, which is the Gulf states. But it was illegal. They're attacking critical national infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, and obviously Gulf states want reparations for that, despite the fact of how targeted their targeting was. As you make the point, they were able to really pinpoint at particular parts of hotels in the UAE or in Bahrain, where they were suggesting American servicemen and women were stationed. It was all very targeted and very precise, but it's still illegal in the way that was done. So that's probably the one thing that Iran is just taken into consideration. They're saying, okay, we'll never have the same relationship with the Gulf states again, but ultimately it's something that we need to do in order to keep alive and to keep that level of deterrence.
Yeah,
and that brought us to this point.
But these Gulf countries also house US bases. Some of them participated in the war. Now, did they participate in the war before or after? It's hard, Saudi said their airbase. Exactly. Well, Saudi said their airbase, their airspace is not allowed to be used in this war. But there's also been reports that it was used throughout the war from the get-go. Unconfirmed reports, just to be clear. Reports that Kuwaiti grounds were used to fire at Iran, and that for the US and Israel to be able to conduct, especially the US to be able to conduct such an operation, the warships or the aircraft carriers alone could not do that. So just from a military perspective, again, you're the expert, not I, but some people have said that it couldn't be done. These strikes couldn't be done purely from the aircraft carriers to that level.
No, they were done from Israel. I mean, Israel is the aircraft carrier. Israel is the aircraft carrier for the US ultimately. And that's why a lot of Israelis are saying, oh, what's the point of having all these bases in the Gulf when ultimately, we are access all areas. If you want to have any of our airspace, any of our bases, you can come to Israel. That's where the case was coming from. There was no strikes. I mean, there's absolutely no evidence that any strike was delivered from prior to the outbreak of the war from the US from the Gulf by the US on Israel, on Iran. So yeah, I think that's very important to bear in mind. That the propaganda that the Iranians are pushing now is saying, oh, this couldn't have been done without their support. The kind of where it becomes sort of wishy-washy or where it becomes a little bit blurry is when it comes to intelligence sharing. A lot of the infrastructure that is spread across the Gulf, the radars and all that sort of stuff, that feeds into a central hub of intelligence sharing that benefits the Israelis and is obviously US-led. And that, in terms of intelligence, the Gulf has played a role, obviously, in supporting these operations. But logistically, militarily, operationally, not. And all the MRAS that were fired, all these missiles that were fired from Kuwait or from Bahrain onto Iran were a response to firing and destroying launches at a time when these launches constituted a fundamental threat to their national security. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. I'm not defending either side, but I have to say that the Gulf states in all of this are the victims. I can't see how you could frame it any other way.
Yeah, I think the biggest victims would be I'd put the first one as Lebanon. I think that Lebanon was the biggest victim in all this. Obviously not Hezbollah, but the Lebanese government, who has voted against Hezbollah to disarm Hezbollah. The second one would probably be Iran and the Gulf, depending on what position you're in. People that are very critical of the US would say Iran is the main victim. That's how the war started. The Gulf should bear blame to this because they housed American bases, even though they weren't used in the early days of the war, allegedly. And obviously the Gulf countries, I live in the UAE, would say that they've declared neutrality, especially countries like Oman, Qatar, for those to be struck, that was a bit of a surprise to me. Even the UAE does a lot of business with Iran, has a lot of expats there. Saudi and Bahrain would be, and even Kuwait would have been, I wouldn't say understandable or justified, but I would have expected, that wouldn't be surprised if those happened. Just on the blockade, the Chinese Defense Ministry just put out a statement as you're speaking. I'm not sure how significant this is, so it's breaking news for the audience. Chinese ships continue to move in and out of the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. We have trade and energy agreements with Iran, which we will respect and abide by. We expect others not to interfere in our affairs. Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz and has opened it to us. So they've reaffirmed the fact that Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, which is a pretty big statement, at least the way I interpret it. A pretty big thing to say for China. They've just confirmed that Iran owns the strait. That's a pretty big thing to say.
It is a big thing to say. I don't think it would go. I'll go that far. I don't think that's the intent of China in all of this. The Chinese have been, funny enough, been fairly respectable of international law when it comes to this part of international law compared to the United States. And so they've honored the freedom of navigation around certain areas. They've obviously tried to bend the law when it comes to the South China Sea in terms of occupying these archipelagos and little islands, which is not necessarily illegal, but it's also not entirely legal. They've been able to work in that gray zone. But for the most part, they have been quite clear on choke points having to be open. And, the blockade by Iran and the blockade by the United States are illegal. I mean, there's been all kinds of people, depending on where you stand, saying, oh, no, there's a case that can be made for Iran to do what they're doing. There's a case for the US to claim that it's legal what they're doing. I mean, if you look at customary law over the last 200 years, it's quite clear that closing choke points that are part of the global commons are essential for global trade and the flow of capital, flow of goods, flow of energy, that they have to remain open. I can't see how the Chinese would justify that, because that's what they firmly believe in. But what is also clear here is that the Chinese very much reject what the Americans are trying to do. And that's why I think this entire blockade business is flawed in terms of the way it's set up, the way it should be implemented. There's ambiguity about the rules of force. How would you actually, and this is going to be the biggest test, saying there is a blockade in place, which is what the Americans have done now, is one thing. How are you actioning it? As soon as you have a Chinese vessel trying to penetrate, going through this quote unquote blockade, and then have the Americans having to deal with this is when you actually enforce the blockade. And I don't see how this is going to work out. What they're going to do if a Chinese ship is not abiding by warnings? Are they going to then board the ship? Are they going to fire shots? How far is this going to escalate? And can they afford escalating when really the Chinese are all about resources? They're quite happy to sit back and relax, eating popcorn while their enemy, the US, is making one mistake after another. But when it comes to their flow of resources, access to critical minerals, if that is something that's being disrupted, that is a core national interest for the Chinese. I can't see them just sitting back and saying, okay, fair enough, we'll wait and see what happens.
So what do you make of that statement? I know you said they respect international law, where they've just said Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. For China, the Chinese Defense Ministry, to say that.
Well, they are effectively
China doubling it.
They are controlling it. If you look at it right now,
but if I know in practice it is, but like everyone's saying, they should not control it. They should not blockade it. It's an illegal blockade. For China to say Iran controls it and they opened it up for us, it's affirming Iranian, I wouldn't say sovereignty, but control or ownership, whatever term you want to use, of the strait. They've opened it up for us. It's meant to be international waters. It's meant to be open for everybody. So they should. Why don't they say something like, these are international waters and we have the legal right to go through them, instead of saying Iran controls it and opened it up for us? The choice of words here is surprising to me, at least.
It is surprising. I don't, there's a lot. The Chinese are the biggest winners of this war anyway. They can play with words. They can put pressure on the US. And it's quite clear, if you're China right now, you're going to side with the Iranians. You might not like the Iranian regime per se, but anything that keeps the Americans in this quagmire and keeps the Americans confronted with another difficult choice, because the US only has difficult choices to make. There isn't an easy way out of that quagmire. And the Chinese will try to make it more difficult. And this could be a rhetorical means to confront the Americans and also the Europeans with quite an uphill battle in terms of how we're dealing with this. Because ultimately, it's going to, you mentioned before, the nuclear program and enrichment. These are all issues that I can see how that can be resolved. The Straits of Hormuz and who controls them, and freedom of navigation around the straits is going to be the major battle. That's going to be the major issue. And I think that will be the defining part of this negotiation. And the Americans don't have a good way out of the status quo right now.
You said China is the biggest winner out of all this. Potentially, shouldn't we say they could be the biggest winner, because they are the biggest importer of energy from the Strait of Hormuz? About 40% of oil coming out of the Straits goes to China. Now, I understand there's a lot of floating oil reserves, all these cargo ships that Iran sent out already that are sitting there in the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. But that maybe sustains China for a few weeks. It's just not that long. And if the Strait of Hormuz continues to be closed, maybe Russia's the biggest winner, but not China. China could end up being a loser out of all this. Could be disruptive for its economy and disruptive for the chips industry as well. In Taiwan, that's not China, but also for the global economy there, including China.
The global economy is definitely suffering, but the Chinese have a robust sort of backdrop against which they can do what they are doing right now. They have a cushion, much more of a cushion than the Europeans. And I think the bet in Beijing is that before it really hurts us, it will hurt the Europeans, it will hurt the Americans, and they'll have to back down. It's a gamble as well. That being said, there are supply chains are very difficult to reroute in the short term, but there are discussions with the Russians. The Russians have a lot of cheap energy that they can export. In the short term, there isn't an alternative for the Chinese. That's true, but there's nearly 100 million barrels of Iranian oil that's been tanked up on vessels at sea right now that could be bought by the Chinese before it arrives at the destination. And the Chinese have very deep coffers. So that will keep them afloat for a few months.
Most of them are already heading to China already.
Yes.
Now, even the ones heading to India, Pakistan, South Korea, Japan. Yeah, you're right. China has a lot of leverage over Iran, because I was talking to General earlier, General Randy, and he was talking about how China's supplying not only the man pads to Iran, but they're also supplying them with HQ-9A defense systems, more capable than the S-300, S-400s. But if you put that together, and the statement now by the defense ministry and the fact that Chinese ships will continue sailing in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, is it fair to say that China, who's already supplying intelligence to Iran, they're doubling down on their indirect involvement in the war? Well, it feels like an escalatory involvement, similar to what we had with NATO and Ukraine early on. In the beginning of the war, Ukraine, NATO was very hesitant. The infamous German helmets to Ukraine. And then as Ukraine put up a really strong fight, as Iran is doing so now, support increased to Ukraine, and that ended up being a quagmire for Russia. Couldn't we see the same thing right now in Iran, with China and even Russia?
I think Iran... Look, this is a major turning point in Middle Eastern history in terms of the way that the Middle Eastern security framework works, the way that the order in the region works. The US as a hegemon is already a relic of the past anyway. That wasn't destroyed over the last few months. That is something that was destroyed over the last 20 years. I think the worst thing the US ever did was getting involved in Iraq. That's for me the end of American empire. That was the beginning of the end. I think we're now towards the end of American empire, especially in the Middle East. In that new order, the Chinese don't have any real cards to play. And there is another important point. I mean, yesterday, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed, went to China, had some very important meetings. Also shows that, the Chinese don't do, and that's very important for their strategic culture, the Chinese don't do zero-sum games. They don't do black and white. Everything is in the gray zone. Nothing is binary. The choices that China has are never binary. And they're quite happy to work with both sides of the Gulf. But I think the new order is one where Iran potentially could emerge more powerful, more detrimental within that framework. That means that, they might not be the hegemon that you want, but they're certainly a power that you need to reckon with. So if you're on the southern side of the Gulf, even in the UAE that are extremely belligerent towards the Iranians, you have to you have no choice but to engage with the Iranians and have the back channels. And so that they will emerge potentially as a greater power than they were before. And so the Chinese might be betting on this. They're saying, okay, we don't have any assets on the ground, but we can work through the Iranians, and by proxy, by surrogate. They're delegating statecraft effectively to the Iranians, which is what they've done in Ukraine as well. It comes very cheap with plausible deniability. If it actually works for China as well in terms of resources, getting access to gas and oil and whatnot. So I think for China, every little inch that America is losing, they are gaining. And they're willing to play at the same time, play the Gulf states as well. Because if it comes to, tech, AI, you see the Emirates obviously have the closest relationship with China right now in the GCC, but Saudi isn't too far behind. There is, there's Saudi or Chinese missile production within Saudi Arabia. I think all of that is going to gradually lead to the disentanglement of the Gulf from America, and not necessarily a full re-entanglement with China, but there are opportunities to kind of chip away of that relationship between the US and the Gulf states.
What happens to the Gulf and Iran? Those two kind of, we're at a fork right now that could easily become more hostile to Iran. And you've talked about the UAE being very hostile. I'm getting different reports on this one. We know Saudi is hostile to Iran. In terms of the UAE, on one side, they do a lot of business with Iran. They've got a lot of expats there. Iranians have a lot of money in the UAE. On the other side, there's been reports that the UAE wanted the US to go ahead with a ground operation in Iran, wanted them to defang Iran. None of this is confirmed. There's been some pretty extreme statements, some pretty aggressive, hawkish statements by the advisor to MBZ as well. To the UAE president. So you put all these together. What's your conclusion on the UAE's position, but also the Gulf position with Iran?
The UAE is a very interesting case study. First of all, you live there. It's a federation. Different countries or different emirates have different approaches to Iran. The Northern Emirates have a much more long-standing and probably more balanced relationship with Iran and Iranians as opposed to Abu Dhabi. Obviously, the island issue is an Abu Dhabi issue for the most part. Dubai has always been very pragmatic, very commercially focused. Iran used the IRGC in particular, but Iran used Dubai as their major access hub to the global economy. And that door has been shut pretty firmly now by the Abu Dhabi government, which shows you how much the UAE is willing to escalate. But nonetheless, I think we also have to kind of differentiate between the communication strategy of Abu Dhabi, which is, Gargash, you mentioned him, but also if you look at Yusuf Utaiba, who's the UAE ambassador in the US, they've been very hawkish towards Iran, and they've been pushing narratives of saying we're doubling down on the relationship with Israel, we're doubling down on the United States relationship. But actually, if you look at the reality of the core heart of decision-making, policy-making in Abu Dhabi, I think there is a degree of pragmatism in all of that. Yes, they will double down on a relationship with the United States, but not at the expense of Russia or China or others. And I do think, and there's just no way around it, if the business model of Dubai wants to succeed, you need to have some sort of agreement ultimately with the Iranians, because you can't be on a war footing indefinitely. The business model of Dubai, which it's about attracting business, it's attracting money, attracting people, it's a service economy. It's probably the only service economy, really. It's, for me, I think it's the crown jewel, if you will, of the Gulf and certainly of the UAE in terms of having built a sustainable post-energy model. If that model wants to survive, it will have to do that with some sort of agreement and appeasement with the Iranians, whether you like it or not. So let's leave these sort of these rhetorics aside. Saudi has tried this sort of trade for peace. That has failed. The Chinese brokered deal that was in the making for the last 3 years has certainly collapsed now. But then again, the Saudis don't have any better alternatives. They're the ones who are saying we need to have a diplomatic off-ramp. We're engaging with the Pakistanis. We work with Qatar. We're willing to work with Oman, the Turks. And so in the background, the Saudis have been very pragmatic in all of this, because they also know there is no second option. There is no military option. There's no military solution unless you are willing to sacrifice everything. And Saudi can't afford to sacrifice everything. Yeah. But there are different camps emerging. I'd say the Gulf is on a spectrum right now. One end of the spectrum is Oman, which has probably the closest relationship, has also been the least attacked by Iran. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the UAE. All of them can't sustain the status quo. That's very clear. None of them want to sustain the status quo, but they all have different means and ways that they favor in order to get out of the status quo. So for
you think the UAE is the most hawkish against Iran? I understand Oman is most hawkish against Iran. Oman is the most friendly. I understand, but you'd say the UAE, and I know you've just explained it, but the UAE is more hawkish on Iran now than Saudi, Qatar. Yes. Saudi, Bahrain. Wow. Okay.
Well, the Bahrainis, I don't want to say anything back. I like the Bahrainis, but Bahrain is a teeny tiny country. I mean, it's a micro state. It's even smaller than the other small states. It's bankrupt. It politically has been either beholden to Saudi, and as of late, obviously, with the deal that was struck a couple of days ago, is now much more closely affiliated with Abu Dhabi. But ultimately, they're not really a sovereign entity, and they're riddled with domestic problems, and that kind of undermines their social political homogeny domestically. And so with all of that, Bahrain clearly has the greatest case to say we are hawkish on Iran because Iran is fiddling with domestic Shia-Sunni divides and whatnot. Yeah. But that being said, they're not really a player. The players in the Gulf are Saudi, UAE, and Qatar. They're the main players. When it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, I think there is only one real player in the GCC, and that's Oman. They are the ones who control the northern tip of it. They have had a relationship with Hormuz pre-Iran, for hundreds of years, trying to keep that or managing that strait. They've been working with the British Empire for a long time managing that. And they have a track record of doing this fairly neutrally by actually making it based on a rules-based system rather than based on who you like and who you don't like. So I think the Omanis should have a much more sort of elevated position in all of this, in negotiating a framework to get through the Strait of Hormuz, as opposed to, let's say, the UAE or Saudi Arabia. And unfortunately, not a lot of people are talking about Oman right now. I mean, they mostly talk about UAE, Saudi, and Qatar.
True. Oman has for almost 5 million people. It's half the size of the UAE in terms of population. Last question, Andreas. Where do you see these peace negotiations end up by end of May? Can't believe we're in April already. I was going to say end of April, end of May.
Well, 6 weeks. 6 weeks is a lifetime, actually, if you think about how slow, or how slow is not the right word, how fast things are moving, but how slow of a progress we've had. I would say, if I had to give a percentage on this, I'd still say that we are probably a 35% chance of this being translated over time gradually into a political agreement, because the alternative of escalation
only
is
35. Wow, 35 is pretty low.
35 is having a robust political agreement. There are other, I'd probably say there's a 30% chance of this being some sort of stalemate where the US walks away from it, but accepts the status quo somewhat and lets the Gulf states just deal with it, with the quagmire and the fallout out of it. And Iran is basically doing what they want to do. The problem with Donald Trump is you can't keep him engaged. This guy is he has the attention scam of a toddler. And probably worse than that. I don't think he can actually sit through an entire reel. And so I don't think he's the kind of guy who will be going through month and month of difficult technical discourse and mediation to get to an agreement. He is very impatient. And that's why I'm saying he might just say, okay, fair enough, let's just keep the ceasefire, but we won't have a comprehensive deal. That's a very likely outcome still, because he doesn't want to go back to war. I think he's been told now that invading Iran, whether any of the islands or Bandar Abbas or, getting boots on the ground to get that Iranian back, these are all non-starters. I mean, militarily disastrous, and they don't have the capacity, capability, or the stomach or the willpower to actually do it. So I think anybody with the same mind would have told them not going to happen. So I think he played his last card with his quote unquote blockade, but it's not a very good one. So ultimately the Iranians can sit this out. The Iranians would like to have a deal, but a likely outcome here is also in case the Americans walk away. And by the way, mind you, the negotiation doesn't include the Gulf states so far. So you will probably see a variety of different bilateral agreements being stacked up, where you have bilateral GCC or Gulf states versus Iran agreements. You have European agreements with the Iranians to get free passage. That is a very likely outcome. I think a return to full-out war at this point is not very likely. But if we kind of keep it in a stalemate where we're not at war, but we're also not at peace, we're going back to Lebanon, which is a sort of Lebanese scenario where it's like Israeli mowing the lawn and the Americans or the Israelis going back as they please, which is also something that the Iranians will not accept. And hence why they're saying we need to kind of reestablish a balance of deterrence. So that's where we stand right now. I think it's still possible, but it's more likely that we stay in a stalemate rather than going back to full out war. But equally, getting a very comprehensive deal is a good chance for that, but not overwhelming one.
Andreas, real pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure. Take care.
For the audience, we've got Alex Christoforou coming on in 20 minutes. And then it'll be our final guest most likely afterwards with Garland Nixon, a regular on the show, both regulars on the show. We'll let you know if there's any other guests that will be joining after Garland. We'll see you all in 20 minutes. Bye.